Tales from the shit.
This is my dog, Uma baby. My best friend in the world, Tripod. And my booth, John Wilkes. Chapter 2, Old Glory Hole. Yeah, a shitter. It was like 10 by 10, annoyingly small, but nicely furnished. Had a lot of marble, I'll give it that. But I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I asked, "What the hell is this?" I'd intended the question to be rhetorical, but despite the urgency, Officer Mulvaney, her name was Mulvaney, was exceptionally helpful. Though winded from the run, she paced herself and said, "It's a private bathroom for the Senate. Rumor has it they call it the Ski Lodge." I was a little slow, so I go, "Ski Lodge?" Officer Mulvaney nodded and said, "Yeah. The word is you make a reservation with a certain senator, then you hit the slopes." Then she air snorted a line of cocaine, totally unexpected. I, however, just nodded in understanding. I am a cross-country skiing bronze medalist. My nostrils flared reflexively and the extra oxygen put me back in the game. With a smooth motion, I pointed to the doors and asked, "Did you lock those?" Officer Mulvaney took a quick look around, then ripped this towel bar off the wall. She shoved it through the door handles and said, "Did now." The mob hadn't been far behind us, and right as I went for that sigh of relief, they began their assault. I'm sure they, like us, saw those double doors and thought they led to someplace important. Almost immediately, they began beating on them with everything they had. It didn't seem to be having much effect, but then every couple of seconds, some of the heavyset guys rammed the doors with their shoulders. Under the immense pressure from all the McDoubles, the towel bar began to flex. Watching that bar flex was probably the most terrified I'd been in my life. The officer, though, my God, what a badass. She didn't even hesitate and pushed back on those doors with everything she had. Inspired, I had this sudden urge to be useful and looked around for anything I could do to help. I didn't have long before the gap between the doors widened. It was clear the towel rod was some cheapo job by the lowest bidder, and I knew it wouldn't survive another assault. The cop, though, kept pushing against the door. She was truly Herculean. Then I heard the mob shouting things like, "Fight for Trump" and "Stop the steal." I tried to look tough, but inside I surrendered myself to the Lord. I considered a New Testament solution, like a coward. But the Lord didn't have time for me to talk it out and push those thoughts from my head. As they faded, it was clear I had to do something, so I looked around for anything to use as some sort of weapon. Like an idiot, I became focused on the lid to the back of the toilet. I ran over and pulled it off, surprised to find it much heavier than expected. But I didn't really get to think about it, and weapon in hand, I turned around to face whatever popped through. But I no sooner stepped forward when, through the gap in the door, my cop buddy got blasted in the face with a riot shield. As she sprawled back, I realized how hard she'd been hit. It was awful. Lots of blood. We're talking immediate swelling. Something inside me snapped, and that's when I knew it was up to me to back the blue. Just don't tell my Antifa buddies. I saw honest-to-God red, like the blood of Christ, and filled with seething Old Testament rage, I pulled back on the toilet lid. When that first motherfucker popped his head through, he got a dent in his skull, and I heard a loud crack. I felt remorse and wondered if I'd blasted him too hard, maybe turned assault into manslaughter. That's why I took a step back to assess. I spared a half second to check the cop and saw her motionless on the floor and reminded myself that had happened because she'd been protecting me. Not cool. I tore my eyes away from her and looked back to the door, just in time to see some dipshit had poked a stick with a Confed-tard rag through. I thought I'd been mad before, but it was then, in that very moment, that I hate morphed into a Yankee Doodle dandy. I think I was foaming at the mouth, probably, and I was so pissed I couldn't say anything. Instead, I held the toilet lid over my head like a fucking caveman hunting in a foregone age. I waited in patient silence, and then, when the head connected to the hand connected to the rag poked through the doors, I laid into his melon with all I had. There was a grunt from me, quickly followed by a much more sickening crack. At first, I thought I'd busted his skull like an egg. But when I opened my eyes, I realized the sound was from the toilet lid. It had shattered on impact, and The air was suddenly full of fine white powder. It seemed my violent action had accidentally made us all a reservation at the ski lodge, as a certain senator had stashed a mountain of snow on the top of the toilet. As soon as I realized I was standing in a cloud of cocaine, I did what anyone would do. I took a deep breath directly through my nose holes. It was like being assaulted by purity. The snow made time stand still, made the confed-tarred rag freeze in place. Most of all, it made me thankful I had my Zippo lighter, a gift from the 101st. To be clear, I didn't serve. I got it at the gift shop, but in the space between heartbeats, I had it out of my pocket. Before that fashtard could retract the rag from the gap between the doors, I'd lit it on fire with a sick schnick from the zip. Sometimes things happen all poetic-like, further evidence of the Christ. The mob fought forward, eager to get into the cloud of cocaine. I dropped what remained of my toilet lid to the floor and, in a sudden surge of coke-fueled anxiety, collapsed beside the cop. I needed to center myself, so I focused and attempted to steady my heart rate. It was me, the little lady, and the mob, and my options were limited. I could stay there and get shit stomped and killed, or I could snatch up her Glock 17 and try to scare the mob away. I went with option 2, as a beat being special guest at a boot party. When I wrapped my hand around that familiar grip, I wasn't scared. No bullshit. I prepared my entire life for that moment. Not a lot of people are going to understand this, and a lot less are going to believe it, but as a kid, I'd trained to kill Nazis. Sure, it was Wolfenstein 3D, but anyone that knows will tell you, I am death incarnate, with over 9,000 hours logged. If this seems drastic, remember my situation. We'd secured the doors and the mob had beat them apart. It was a clear indication they weren't interested in diplomacy. In fact, they maintained a herd-like instinct and pressed forward. With that final push, the towel bar was wrenched from the doors and they burst open. The mob looked down at me, a coked-out priest cradling a shapely but unconscious cop. So I cowboyed up and put my arms all triangle and my eyes narrowed down the day-glow sights. As a good guy with a gun, I prepared myself to do what I had to do. Safe to say, the cocaine helped. Now, before I go any further, let me explain. I might be nearsighted, but I've attempted enough murders to know what that looks like, okay? That mob was an attempted murder, and I know this because the only thing that stopped them is the same thing that always stops me. They were not very well organized. If they'd gotten somewhere important, say the Senate chambers, there's no telling what they would have done. The fact I had a gun didn't faze them. I could tell they didn't think I would use it, so I didn't bother with a warning. I knew the true test was yet to come. They'd hear that first shot and either scatter or swarm. It was like time itself hesitated as I began to apply pressure to the trigger. Then, right as I neared the sweet spot, there was this loud bang. But it wasn't me, honest. I hadn't crossed the point of no return. This shot had come from somewhere else in the Capitol. While I knew the Trumpers had probably gained a martyr, I was happy that I hadn't provided it. But that's all it took was one supersonic reminder. The mob looked down and quickly snapped out of their hypnosis when they realized I had a mag full of 120 grain mortality. As soon as the front row understood another step meant they wouldn't return to their climate control and cable TV, they seized their advance. Behind them, the remainder of the herd complied, other than the dipshit in the Viking helmet. He pointed off behind me, snorted, then goes, "Hey, this is the men's room, not the chambers of Congress." That's all it took, and my part in the riot was over. The mob turned and filed out, neat as could be. We were fortunate they were like dogs chasing a car. Once they caught it, they had no fucking clue what to do with it. I exhaled in relief, inhaled as much as I could, and surveyed the scene as I rubbed my nose. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone with a cop inside a men's room. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone with a cop inside a men's room, but it was the first time I hadn't had my heart broken. By that point, it had nearly finished snowing, so I pinched together some of the cocaine off the floor and rubbed it into the officer's gums. Slowly, she regained consciousness. I know giving her cocaine seems extreme, but like I keep telling you, I'm a doctor. I helped her to her feet, and though wobbly at first, I didn't need to help her out the door. By that point, the mob was long gone, and with it, the commotion. In fact, I'd only helped the officer a few stumbling steps when we heard someone walking towards us. It was a distinctive padded step, and you better believe I recognized the resonance of popish Gucci loafers. A sound like that could only come from one type of person, a politician. So, I leveled the Glock, figured nobody had missed a straggler. But guess, just guess, who rounded the corner in front of us? None other than my nemesis, Ted fucking Cruz. In a way, I was glad he was there. It meant the mob wasn't coming back. Think about it. It's Ted Cruz. Nobody wants to be around that fucking guy. At the time, I thought he'd never be a threat, so I lowered my weapon. I assumed he was there to back the blue, that he'd come to offer the cop assistance. But no. Instead, he got all like haughty, and looking directly at me, pointed and goes, "Rabbi, you scumbag. What happened to the snow under that lid?" That's when I realized all the cocaine in the air, the remainder of which I currently carried, was his. So I stashed the Glock safely into my waistband and said, "It was the mob, Ted. Your constituents. They're animals. I think perhaps they thought it was sugar." For a moment, Ted held it together. Then, shaking and clearly in need of a fix, he screeched, "Fuck!" and took off toward the ski lodge. My cop buddy, bloody, bruised but impressed, said, "You know, you really must have God on your side." I laughed and told her, "Probably." She must have thought I wasn't being serious because she added, "I mean it. You got rid of a mob and Ted Cruz." I flashed the Glock in my waistband and said, "Well, I had this." Then I accidentally dropped the tattered sack of cocaine, but I wasn't worried. I knew she let me keep the blow as a professional courtesy. It was the gun I was worried about. I pulled it out of my pants, fully intending to give it back, and a miracle happened. The first of many. No bullshit. The lady officer, she told me to keep it, honest. She smiled and shouted, keep it. As a man of the Lord, I know you'll do great work." I told her, "Thanks," and meant it. It's not often that a man like me has the support of people in uniform, and it's not something I'd squander. "I think since I had her trust, the cop told me the truth," she said. "Don't think me. That gun's haunted. Has 4 black guys on it." Now, I don't believe in that shit at all. Ghosts, not police brutality. Despite that, I told her, "Well, it's a good thing I'm a rabbi." She goes, "Rabbi? You're dressed like a priest." I told her, "I'm in drag." I couldn't resist. She didn't know what to say and went with, "Well, take care of yourself. I have work to do." With that, she was off. I didn't stop her because I knew she was right. The Capitol Police were in a fight for the life of the country, and they'd need every able-bodied officer they could get. As for the gun, well, for a cop piece, body count seemed low. Not to mention, dressed as I was, I need a friend to get through the riot. Though my thoughts lingered on my nemesis Theodore Cruz, I knew I needed to escape the building, especially since I had about 6+ pounds of his cocaine. Despite the urgency, I took my time with my exit to make it appear that I belonged. On my way out, I decided to change my cover and snatch this long white scarf and a Heisenberg hat I found in the cloakroom. When I passed a shit-filled trash can, I tore away my white collar, it was a clip-on, and tossed it in, where it seemed to belong. Just like that, I transformed myself into my ultimate form, a universal rabbi. Everyone who was anyone on the hill would be terrified of both me and my agenda, which was good. As I slinked my way out of the Capitol, I ducked into a random office to grab a stack of files. Nothing classified, it was from HR. Despite this, they were an important part of my escape plan, as you'll see. The office was a mess, the furniture wrecked, and one of the windows shattered. I used a chair to swat the remainder of the glass away and scrambled out the opening. Only by the grace of God did I avoid any injury. I made it outside, but to my dismay, the mob still existed. Unfortunately, it hadn't been put down with fire and sword. But dressed as I was, the Trumpites didn't concern me. I knew I was fist deep in Zionists and couldn't be safer. What I was concerned about as I made my way through the scattered mass was the fact Ted Cruz was on the balcony of the Capitol, shouting to the mob, in what seemed to be German. Shit was bonkers.